Welcome to everyone, and I must commend Kamla and her team on putting together this conference. From all indications, I was on for a short period yesterday, and I must say that you had some very spirited discussions. So I'm sure this has continued this morning. Unfortunately, I wasn't there, and I'm sure it will continue for the rest of the evening. But I think more importantly is that it will add value to the discussions on good governance within our region, because we have such a wide cross-section of presenters. So let me just share my screen with you, if I can. Is everybody seeing it? Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Let me just make sure now that better?
Yes, that's quite
all
good.
Right. So what I'm going to share with you over the next 20 minutes is really the future of role of legislation, really in framing corporate governance. And what I'm really going to talk to you about is Jamaica's experience, because I think as a small developing country, there's a lot that we've had to learn. And I do believe some of the lessons learned can help and add value to other countries in the region and even small developing countries outside of Jamaica. So there are four areas that I'm going to be looking at. First of all, who have been the players in our market? Who are really been in the corporate governance market in Jamaica? So we're going to talk a little about who those people are and what was really our tipping point in Jamaica for corporate governance. Why did we now start to see this as something that, hey, we've got to do this? And then what is it that we have done, right? So what do we have in place? And of course, to share with you some lessons learned that we think can add value going forward. So within the context of Jamaica, and Jamaica is the third largest island in the region, we have, of course, our public sector and we have our private sector. So our private sector, really, of course, within the governance structure has its shareholders, it has its board, management, and employees. And what you're going to find in our private sector is that we have governing boards in the private sector, and those entities are normally registered under the Companies Act. We also have a number of listed companies who are also registered under the Companies Act, and they have governing boards also. And then we have a number of regulated entities who are not just under the Companies Act, but of course they're regulated, whether it be through our Financial Services Commission or through the Bank of Jamaica, being financial institutions. And of course, most importantly, when we talk about governance, you have stakeholders. On the public sector side, not much difference in that at the top of it, we have our responsible minister. So that's the minister who is responsible for a particular ministry. And they're the ones who make a recommendation to cabinet to appoint boards. And the board then appoints management, and then management, of course, appoints employees. So within the context of Jamaica, we have over 162 public bodies. That's a very large number. Might I tell you, it's coming from 190. So there's a lot of work that we've been doing to see, well, how do we consolidate some of these public bodies? So we have the public bodies, and some of them actually have what we call establishing statutes, right? And some of them are governing companies. So they are actually set up under the Companies Act also. And then we have also what we call executive agencies, and they don't have governing boards. They actually have advisory boards. And as we know, advisory boards, these are boards that provide advice to the CEO. And like the private sector, they also have stakeholders, the people of Jamaica, that hold them accountable. So that's what our framework is. We have both public sector and private sector entities that we're looking at. But you know, a lot has happened in Jamaica. And just to give you an idea, these are some of the headlines that we've seen in Jamaica over many years. And I'll just share with you the years of some of these extracts. So if you look from 1958, we've been having corruption. I won't tell you if that's before I was born. And we continue, 1984. We continue to 2001, 2017. It's just been consistent. Every other day, there are headlines of corruption taking place. And there comes a time when we really, as a people, have had to say, can we take this on anymore? How did we really get to this situation? And what are we going to do? Because there has to be a time where we have to make changes. So corruption drove us to this tipping point, and that really started in the 1990s. And I like to say it's a puzzle, and the puzzle is still incomplete. We're only just still putting together pieces. So, for example, in 1990, we had a massive financial crisis in Jamaica, which impacted very negatively on our financial institutions. Emanating from that, we had a number of legislations. We also saw high levels of public sector corruption. We had something called the Fat Cat scandal, where the amounts that CEOs were being paid by boards who were not accountable to anyone, created a great uproar in our country. And it was those activities, it was that actually drove us to a point to say, no, something has to happen here. So, of course, I am sure many of you know that when things significant as these happen in our country, our governments like to say, let's establish a committee. No different in Jamaica. We did a committee. So we actually formed a committee called the Thorburn Committee, and that was because it was led by Mr. Thorburn. So 1990 was really a turmoil year for us, driven a lot by the financial crisis and just on the private sector side, but also on the public sector side, high levels of corruption. So what did this Thorburn Committee find? And they were looking at the public sector in particular. And what they really found is that there was just no clear understanding of roles and relationships of boards with their ministry, and of course, the Ministry of Finance. So people became directors and they didn't have a clue as to what it is they were supposed to be doing. The other thing we found is that changes in boards took place once you had a change in a government. So if we had an election, the entire board resigned. So you can imagine in the private sector that we have a change in shareholdership and the entire board resigns. So there's no continuity at all. And the other thing, which was so important, was the fact that people who are being appointed to boards, there was no competency or no rhyme or reason as to how they even got onto the board. And when they got on there, the maintenance of poor financial records was very, very prevalent. So these were some of the findings that were in the Thorburn Committee. And what we found is that that committee said, you know, from a public body perspective, here is what we need to do. We actually need to have one overarching legislation that will govern the operations of public bodies. And that is what led us in 2000 to actually establish what we call the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, which is the only piece of legislation like itself in the region, right? So the government accepted the Thorburn recommendation and developed the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, which actually came into being in 2001. So from the private sector perspective, in 2001, we also introduced our new Companies Act, which actually spoke in much more detail to the fiduciary responsibilities of directors. Because one of the things that we found in our financial crisis, and a part of the research that I had done also, was that the majority of entities that failed in our financial institutions were indigenous financial institutions. So what we found is that places or banks like CIBC, Bank of Nova Scotia, while they had challenges in the period, they surely did not fail like all the indigenous institutions. And when we looked within the context of the institutions, while there were some external factors that contributed to that in terms of high interest rate, etc., one thing that we found that was consistent with our indigenous institutions is that the same person who had the majority shares was also the chairman of the board, was also the CEO. So if we go back and we look at what we know as governance specialists, that they control the 3 levels of governance or power within the organization. And that was actually quite significant, because that's what we found with all the indigenous institutions that actually failed in the financial crisis. So we came up with the new Companies Act. We had a new Financial Services Act, which now started to regulate financial institutions that weren't listed. Then we also had a new Banking Services Act also, because it was the financial institutions that were really significantly impacted. Because what you found again was that a lot of these institutions, they were banks, but they also owned insurance companies. They went into agriculture, they went into real estate, they went into everything. And there was no proper legislation in place to guide them. Then we also found that the central bank introduced what we call corporate governance best standards. So for all financial institutions, they actually had to abide by these best practices. Then the PSOJ in 2001, with all that was happening, we as the major and the premier advocacy organization in Jamaica, we thought that it was important, first of all, to establish a corporate governance committee. But the most important thing for us actually was to develop a corporate governance code, which is something that we did and actually rolled it out in 2006, because it did take some time for it to happen. But what is important to note is that that type of code is really a comply or explain. The PSOJ is not a regulatory body. That's not our interest. What we wanted to do was to provide guidelines for private sector entities to be able to establish good corporate governance practices. And then the other thing that happened in the 2000s was the establishment of a regional corporate governance code. I can tell you, Patrick McDonald and myself were the 2 Jamaican representatives. We did many trips in the region. We had people from Trinidad, St. Lucia, entire region, Guyana, everybody. We traveled many times to St. Kitts and to Antigua, where we had numerous meetings, and we finalized a regional corporate governance code that would have some basic principles to really help to get the entire region now on a governance footing. And might I say, it was signed off and handed over to CARICOM, and handed over to CARICOM, and handed over to CARICOM, and it's still sitting in CARICOM. Nothing has happened with it. So I want to share with you a little about this Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, because it's not something that many people are very familiar with, because it doesn't exist anywhere else in the region. So what this act actually does is really the authority now for public bodies. Because of the challenges that we saw, we established this act now, which would provide the governance framework for all public bodies. Every public body had to operate like this. So it would bring consistency and harmony into their operations, greater compliance, right, with government policy, and of course, improve and enhance the public body's performance. Now, the legal requirements under the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, and it's the only piece of legislation we have in Jamaica where Section 6.1 speaks to only corporate governance. So not even the Companies Act has it as structured as this. And it actually says clearly what every board must have and the steps that they must take to ensure the efficient and effective management of the public body. It talks about ensuring that there are effective controls that are set up, that there are measurable objectives and targets that have been established, and that the responsible minister is aware of policy. German policy, it's not policy where he is supposed to come and do anything operational, but we are supposed to at least advise the minister, and he will share with the board the top line policy of the government, which is what will guide the public body. The important thing to note about this piece of legislation, which we can always find online, is that it actually has sanctions. So Section 25 says that if you breach not having in place your corporate governance practices, not having in place a proper audit committee, not attending board meetings, because it speaks to that also, that if you don't attend 3 consecutive board meetings, then we can say that you're no longer on the board. There are sanctions in place, right? And people could be fined up to $1 million, Jamaican dollars. So I want you to keep that in mind. So we have this strong piece of legislation for public bodies that actually includes sanctions. On the private sector side, as I said, we have a code, and we consider that to be kind of our soft law, because that code, it goes through and it has 8 different principles, and it does give you what your principles are, your supporting principles and your guidelines. Again, it's not legislative. We have tried to encourage our members as private sector members to participate and to be and utilize it. And what I will say is that the Jamaica Stock Exchange has actually taken it on board and said that listed companies should use the PSOJ Corporate Governance Code as guidance in implementing their corporate governance practices. The corporate governance framework for public bodies is the next thing that we're going to talk about, because that's the next piece of the puzzle. Because the 2001 Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, people complained. We didn't understand aspects of the legislation. How do you implement these things? How do we monitor these things? So what we decided in Jamaica is that, okay, so we will now develop a corporate governance public bodies framework, which will complement how people will react or respond to the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act. So it's really a tool that details what they need to do and how, not the what is in the legislation, the framework is really telling you the how. So the third piece of that puzzle in the 2010 now was the development of this corporate governance framework for public bodies. The other thing that we looked at was a competency profile, because again, it's so important to ensure that you get the right person on the board. And yesterday I was in the session that spoke to the issues of induction and orientation. And if you don't have the right person on the board, the induction and orientation won't add the type of value that you really, really want. So it really starts at getting the right person on the board. Also now on the private sector side, for the Jamaica Stock Exchange in 2010, they introduced a corporate governance rule for the first time, and they have been operating since 1968. So Rule 414 was introduced, and all listed companies, whether you're on the main market or the junior market now, have to abide, or should, I should say, abide by those rules.